So welcome everyone. We are very delighted today to have our very own Dr. Jonathan Feuer to give a talk on Korean Buddhist chaplains in the Vietnam War. Let me read out the biography of Jonathan now. Dr. Jonathan Feuer is a Kansi Foundation supported postdoctoral fellow in the Center of Buddhist Studies here at Hong Kong U, specializing in modern Korean Buddhism. He holds a PhD in Asian languages and cultures from UCLA, and his current book project, Buddhist Militarism, Violence, and Religious Freedom, explores the challenges modern Korean Buddhism has faced by establishing a military chaplaincy, such as how to navigate the Buddhist-state relationship and how best to propagate their religion and how to define Buddhist monasticism. His wider research interests include religion and violence, Buddhist modernity, and also Korean history. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan, please.
Okay. Thank you, Junfu, for the nice introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to the Center of Buddhist Studies for having me here for the last school year, and of course to the Kensei Foundation, who has really generously supported my postdoc and allowed me to continue doing the research that I'll be presenting with you to you today. So my presentation today will cover one piece of my current book project, like Junfu nicely introduced, where I look at the history and the lived experiences of South Korean Buddhist military chaplains. This work is based off the last 6 years or so of research. It started as my PhD dissertation, and now I'm kind of in the final stages of it as a book manuscript. My project is really motivated by both the popular and scholarly assumption that Buddhist military chaplaincies involve some intricate reworking of Buddhist doctrine or philosophy because the violence inherent to the military seems so antithetical to Buddhist kind of beliefs in nonviolence and peace. You know, after all, the first of the seminal 5 precepts in Buddhism are a commitment to non-harm. But what I argue in my book project is that rather than involving a reinterpretation of doctrine, the Buddhist chaplaincy more so involved a reevaluation of Korean Buddhists' self-identified modernization strategy. They saw the chaplaincy in terms of their long-held modernizing goals of propagating their religion more widely, being more socially engaged, and even expressing Buddhist religious freedom in the new South Korean state. But in this push, in creating the chaplaincy towards modernization, the chaplaincy caused a lot of new challenges for the community, like how to deal with the new Buddhist-state relationship, especially at a time when Korea was run by a military dictatorship. Also, how best to propagate their military when there was really no precedent to do this and little funding or resources. They also had a difficult time differentiating chaplains from monastics. But the main issue that I want to focus on today is the challenge of how to participate in wars, especially a war that involves other Buddhists. I have this here. So you can see here the table of contents from my book project, the history, some of the doctrine behind the chaplaincy, placing the chaplaincy in kind of the longue durée of Korean Buddhist history, looking at issues in propagation, the lives of chaplains. And what I'm focusing on today is this seminal moment in the chaplaincy's history when it was created in 1968 during South Korea's large-scale participation in the Vietnam War. And though kind of part of this research is fairly complete as part of my book project, I'm continuing to research this topic as I find it kind of really interesting looking at these kind of transnational Buddhist dimensions of the war and especially its impact on Korean Buddhists and the wider religious communities in Korea. So as we kind of look here at an interesting photo I have from a military Dharma hall in Korea, where you see a kind of, it's a large mural with Avalokiteshvara Buddha there, but surrounded by soldiers on the lotus petals there. And, this kind of always serves as sort of an interesting background, I think, kind of playing with some of these typical images in Buddhism in different ways. And I think it really kind of gets at this deep interest I have in how wars and conflict influence or affect religious communities. I can say I grew up in the United States at a time with things like 9/11 and wars in the Middle East that brought up a lot of these kind of religious conflict issues with Muslims, Christians, Jews. I got interested in looking at, say, Buddhist conflicts in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar in recent times. And, I see how wars really challenge a lot of religions, ethics, and institutions. They bring up new issues that a community may never have thought of before. And they also expose differences, say, between institutional perspectives or leadership perspectives and everyday religious believers. And really, I think that the main kind of interactions that religious communities have with conflict is not always about justifying or refuting a war. It's really about meeting the practical challenges in front of them, what's affecting them as immediately as possible, and adjusting to these as they go on. There's not always so much time to kind of navigate some of those, wider, more abstract ethical issues involved. I think scholarship in religious studies kind of needs more in this aspect, and especially in Buddhist studies, where I think Buddhist studies has been slow to kind of recognize a lot of these modern conflicts and their effect on Buddhist communities. I think we should look at more of how these issues affect communities in more of a sociological or historical perspective. I kind of like this work that's been done recently and this term that's come up of bad Buddhists or bad Buddhism. Right? Scholars have kind of coined this term recently for those Buddhists that go against the very normative Western discourse that presents Buddhism as a very pacifist, apolitical religion that focuses on internal mental states. And these scholars, like myself, argue that if we ignore these quote unquote bad Buddhists, using this in sort of a facetious way, they're not actually bad Buddhists, but if we ignore these quote-unquote bad Buddhists, we reproduce colonial attitudes in Buddhist studies, and we do nothing to address structural violence, systemic violence, and often ignore the lived experiences of Buddhists themselves. I think there's a lot to be said, say, for Japanese Buddhists or Chinese Buddhists during World War II, where those communities were deeply affected, and Buddhist-state relationships in those countries still kind of have histories in that period, as well as modernizations or revitalization strategies. I think Tibetan Buddhist identity in modern times is very much tied to the conflicts of the 1950s and their aftermath. Even modern Buddhist internationalism has its roots in decolonial struggles and the Cold War as well. I think we need to really ask ourselves in studying these cases of what were the novel challenges facing these religious communities as they dealt with the conflict. And this is where really my study of the Vietnam War comes in. The Vietnam War challenged Buddhist communities around the globe with things like communism, colonialism, and nuclear war in the mid-20th century. Scholars have rightly really focused on Vietnamese Buddhists in this case, right? Thich Nhat Hanh's engaged Buddhist movement, for example, was really developed and popularized during this period. Scholars have also focused on Thai Buddhists, who were also part of the conflict, as well as American religious communities and American military policies towards Buddhism that deeply affected the religious picture back home in the United States. And, the Korean Buddhist community is no exception in this case. The chaplaincy was founded, as I said, in 1968 during Korea's large-scale participation in the war. And I think the war is so integral to understanding modern Korean Buddhism's trajectory. And through the chaplaincy, we get these direct, on-the-ground insights into what Korean Buddhists were learning on the from Vietnamese Buddhists in this conflict. So I want to start kind of getting into some of these experiences with a short anecdote. This comes from first-generation chaplain, Kwon Oh-yeon, who you see standing there second from the right. This was also the kind of title slide for this talk as well. Kwon was one of the chaplains I got to know quite well during my field work, telling me a lot about these early experiences. And one of his stories comes from one day in 1970 when he had been serving in Vietnam for over a year at that point. He got word that a monk and 9 lay people were killed during their early morning prayers at a temple in Cam Ranh, Vietnam. The killings were carried out by Viet Cong, the communist guerrilla troops, wearing imitation Korean troops' uniforms. The Viet Cong's propaganda machine blamed the killings on the Korean military. And the local community began to really turn against the Korean military's presence there. So Kwon's battalion that was stationed nearby was called in to investigate. They looked at their records and saw that none of their soldiers were nearby at the times of the killings. And they also interviewed local witnesses who said that, they couldn't identify anyone in his battalion that could have been there that morning. But Kwon said that this did no good. The local community had turned against them, and even Buddhist leadership across Vietnam began protests against the Korean military. So Kwon's division commander turned to him and said, you're our kind of Buddhist expert here, so you go in and try to quell this situation. So he went and met with the local Vietnamese Buddhist leader in the area, a quite devout monk who Kwon said undoubtedly believed the Korean military committed the killings. So Kwon, with his kind of basic Vietnamese language skills, told the monk about the lack of evidence and the witnesses' testimonies, but this was doing no good, as he said. So in one of their final meetings, Kwon tried to appeal to their shared East Asian Buddhist heritage and took out a pen and paper and wrote in Chinese characters, not to commit wrongs, but to do all that is good. And the Vietnamese monk laughed, took the pen, and wrote, to keep one's thoughts pure, this is the teaching of all the Buddhas, completing the line from the verse of the shared morality of the 7 Buddhas. Kwon said this little moment of interaction kind of opened the door for more dialogue between the two. He further explained the situation, and the two of them decided to have a funeral service for the fallen monk and lay people. They then held a joint precept ceremony, giving the lay precepts to Vietnamese lay people and Korean soldiers in a shared ceremony. They then held a large Buddhist gathering and event and invited all of the local community to come, Korean soldiers as well as journalists, and gave out Buddhist gifts and did various rituals and ceremonies. After this, Kwon said that the local community became more friendly to the Korean military, and the next day the journalists kind of vindicated them in the news. So how can we begin to kind of understand this interaction? Like, there's a lot going on there. We have kind of Vietnamese military, Korean military, various Buddhists on either side, and the media, and so forth. So, we'll take a quick look at what's going on in the Vietnam War, right? So the Vietnam War was about a 20-year conflict fought at the end of French colonial rule in Vietnam. Vietnam had been ruled, by France for decades prior to that, I guess almost a century or so. And after a decolonial war, Vietnam was split into North and South Vietnam, with North Vietnam taking a communist identity, allied with the PRC and Soviet Union. South Vietnam, a more capitalist identity, allied with the US, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea. And, this was kind of a continuation of that decolonial struggle as well, trying to kind of have this kind of fight over power for the new Vietnam. And this war really escalated in the 1960s when the United States became deeply involved, sending hundreds of thousands of troops yearly there. The PRC got deeply involved, not as much with troops, but with many supplies and weapons and food. And, after this 20-year period, millions of deaths, catastrophic environmental damage, North Vietnam won the war and united Vietnam into what it is today, right? So it's a very monumental conflict in the modern history of Vietnam, also in the United States, where I'm from, where it's really kind of a massive failure of U.S. policy and really affected a lot of the kind of social fabric in the U.S. as well. But what is kind of less known about this war was South Korean participation. South Korea was the second largest foreign force in the war, behind the United States, fighting on the side of the South Vietnamese. They sent about 300,000 troops, 100,000 civilian contractors over a 9-year period there. Historians of Korea looking at this conflict, kind of characterize it in quite stark terms. They say that Korean soldiers were mercenaries hired by the United States to help kind of the United States' Cold War neo-imperialist project. South Korea made a lot of money. The soldiers made a lot of money, as did the nation, getting over 12 billion US dollars kind of injected into the economy from this war. On kind of another note, understanding South Korea's economic rise over the last 50 years, you can't understand it without understanding this war. It really kind of jettisoned the economy forward. State propaganda in South Korea at the time really characterized it in these sort of neo-imperialist terms, talking about, kind of developed South Korea helping their poor Vietnamese allies in their time of need, where Korea was poor in the past, so too now is Vietnam, and we're now modern and developed, and we can go help them there. So I think a lot of these characterizations are somewhat true. And, looking at even the Buddhist military chaplains, the little bit of scholarship that's on this already says they were like missionaries, almost like Christian missionaries who were used by colonial Europe and the United States to kind of pacify local communities in a time of war. This was kind of a very, typical past for these Christian missionaries, right? But I think these characterizations of both the Korean military, but especially kind of Buddhist chaplains serving there, are very much through this political lens. And, indeed, a lot of Buddhist media at the time couched it in some of these terms. But I think it doesn't adequately account for the actual experiences of Buddhist chaplains and soldiers on the ground, and how much they began to learn from their experiences in Vietnam. What the government or the Buddhist leadership didn't account for was the knowledge that these chaplains and soldiers gained by serving in Vietnam. While they often came to see their nation as maybe industrially or technologically more modern than Vietnam, as Buddhists, they saw their religion as less modern than Vietnamese Buddhists. They saw the growing socially engaged Buddhist movement in Vietnam that had these robust social welfare organizations. They witnessed these large political movements by Vietnamese Buddhists that had the power to overturn government policy. Back home in South Korea, Buddhists were really doing nothing of the sort. They were floundering in a lot of these social engagement efforts and had very little political clout. So these chaplains started to kind of develop a new idea for their work and new futures for what they thought their religion could be as a more modern and socially active Buddhism. So we see here the first 5 chaplains commissioned for the South Korean military in 1968, and 4 of them were sent immediately to the battlefields of Vietnam. Now we call these men chaplains in English, but in Korean they're called kunseung or kunbopsa, literally military monk or military dharma teacher. are kind of getting, I think, more accurately at their sort of mixed identity. This position or this institution started very small, but today there are about 130 Buddhist chaplains working in the military, alongside 250 Protestant chaplains, 100 Catholic chaplains, and a few Buddhist chaplains, a smaller kind of new Buddhist movement in Korea. And that kind of breakdown really matches the very pluralistic religious picture of Korea, right? And at the time, it was quite similar, with these kind of major religions sort of propagating and sort of working for their followers in the military. Buddhist chaplains, they work in the military, often wearing their uniform, military uniforms, carrying weapons, counseling, teaching soldiers, providing religious services, and doing Buddhist rituals, and serving the military's mission on and off the battlefield. The Korean chaplaincy is quite unique in the Buddhist world too. Only Thailand has a comparably large Buddhist military chaplaincy today, and the US and UK also have them, but only a few kind of commissioned officers. And this is also set in the military situation in Korea, right? Korea is still technically at war with North Korea, so there's mandatory military service for all men, including Buddhist monks, Christian pastors, and so forth. No men are exempt from service unless you have a, say, health issue or something like that. So there were 14 chaplains in total who served in Vietnam over about a 5-year period. And really, it was the Vietnam War that kind of catalyzed the creation of the chaplaincy in 1968. And this is, if you look at official histories of by the military or the Buddhist order, this is exactly what it says. But I think through my research, I've seen how the story kind of goes much deeper in how the chaplaincy was created in the context of the Vietnam War. And it really begins with the 1963 Buddhist crisis in South Vietnam. So maybe this image is familiar to many, if not all of you. It's the kind of world-famous photo of Thich Quang Duc's self-immolation in protest of the South Vietnamese government's treatment of Buddhists there. So at the time, Vietnam was kind of ruled by a Catholic government that was a minority in the nation, and it was held up by the United States and its allies, and Buddhists felt they were being mistreated, unfairly treated by this Catholic government, and they began these kind of large-scale protests that did, in fact, lead to the assassination eventually of the president at the time and a new government that was more friendly to Buddhists. So around the world, this image became famous, and South Korea was no different. Media in South Korea was showing this image, talking about the oppressed Buddhists and the political upheaval in Vietnam. And Buddhist media in Korea especially kind of took the reins, and writers really stood up in support of the Vietnamese Buddhist struggle. And kind of looking at the media at the time, we saw how, Korean Buddhist, writers and leaders, they couched it in terms of these kind of Cold War conflict, communism versus freedom, and kind of religious freedom and repression, Christians wanting to dominate Buddhists in this sense. And, they also kind of framed it in terms of this millennia-long struggle for the survival of Buddhism, that things like communism or Christian minorities were just new enemies in a millennia-long fight for Buddhist survival. And in a year after this, in 1964, the first Korean combatant troops were sent to Vietnam. Buddhist temples around the country in South Korea held farewell ceremonies for the departing soldiers. And the Buddhist leaders often in their speeches at these events not only framed the war in terms of a national war, but a war for the sake of Buddhism. And it was in this kind of environment, with the Korea entering the war, that Korean and Vietnamese Buddhist communities began to interact more deeply with one another. Korean Buddhist leaders began to visit Vietnam, as did Vietnamese Buddhist leaders visit Korea. You see one major leader of Korean Buddhism at the time, Master Kyongsang, there in a visit to Vietnam in the mid-1960s. Well, when Vietnamese Buddhist leaders and monks visited Korea especially, they really made a large impression on the Korean Buddhist community. They really showed off a lot of their political know-how, their ability to engage with international Buddhist networks. They kind of taught Korean Buddhists about these strategies in education or about connecting to other Buddhists across the world. And seeing this, a lot of Buddhist media at the time began to reflect on the inferiority of their own Buddhist movements at home. They said that, Korean Buddhist leadership had little organizational skills and was often caught up in their own sort of corruption and infighting, whereas Vietnamese Buddhists had this vast political strength and were actually doing what kind of modern, socially active Buddhists were supposed to do. And I think this editorial from the Buddhist newspaper from 1965 kind of shows off that opinion really well. The author, after kind of pointing out some of the affinities between Korean and Vietnamese Buddhists, they talked about how South Vietnam and North Vietnam were fighting each other, just like South Korea and North Korea were fighting each other in this Cold War picture. They talked about similarly being kind of oppressed by Christian minorities in each other's countries. They talked about their shared Mahayana Chinese Buddhist background with all these affinities and of calling each other Buddhist brothers. But then the author goes on to say that today, compared to South Vietnamese Buddhists, Korean Buddhism is indifferent to politics, and that leaders always take this aloof attitude towards getting politically or socially engaged. And the author concludes that not putting up resistance against an improper regime or improper governance can be said to be the character of our Buddhism, and really advocates for learning more from Vietnamese Buddhists in their kind of political and social activities. So in this situation of the Vietnam War, kind of learning about these sort of new trends in modernizing Buddhism, across the Buddhist community in Korea, they identified the chaplaincy as a key new way to modernize their religion. The chaplaincy had been in the works for a few years prior, and there were kind of other factors that sort of hindered its creation in the early days. But it was really this urgency of the Vietnam War and this interaction, this solidarity growing between the two nations' Buddhists that further motivated Korean politicians who were kind of supporting the cause, Buddhist leadership, but especially students and soldiers. There were protests outside of government buildings, the parliament building, protests outside Buddhist temples, led by students and young soldiers who demanded having a Buddhist chaplaincy as a way to help kind of young people in their need, how to modernize Buddhism and how to be more like these Vietnamese Buddhists who were showing this great example. So after a few years of delays, the establishment of the chaplaincy was assured in 1968, and the first Buddhist chaplains were sent to Vietnam on New Year's Day of 1969. So when chaplains arrived in Vietnam on that day, they felt somewhat prepared for the situation. They had been in training for years, studying Buddhist teachings, studying military strategy, studying Vietnamese language and culture. So when they kind of went on this mission, they were quite, had high expectations. and so forth, but they were quickly kind of dampened with the situation there. And we see this other kind of retelling by Kwon Oh-hyun, the first generation chaplain who I mentioned in the anecdote earlier, recalling his first day landing in Vietnam. He says, D-Day, January 1st, 1969, it was so cold at Busan's third wharf in southern Korea, the water seemed like it would completely freeze over. As the farewell ceremony ended, the boat horn sounded for our departure. We disembarked at Nha Trang in Vietnam's central region. The sounds of guns and the rain falling through the fog-wrapped harbor were as if there was a ferocious battle nearby. My first steps onto Vietnamese soil were not at all unfamiliar. I thought it looked familiar because of the news I'd read. Palm trees and the procession of motorcycles were wonderful. The Peng Ma Company's location was 20 kilometers from Nha Trang down a mountainous region. As soon as I arrived at the company's headquarters, I received training. For 2 days and 1 night of realistic ambush training, I felt the fear and danger of ambush operations, and for the first time, I felt the horrors of war in my skin. So a lot of their work kind of started with these expectations, but I think once they kind of got on the battlefield and experienced what was going on, a lot changed. And despite maybe not being ready for the conflict and the violence that they were about to see, they also realized that even though they were trained, they were the first generation, and they were really kind of trailblazing this job as a chaplain that no one before them had really given them any instruction to do. So they were kind of met with this heavy task of trying to sort of define their work in terms that they believed in. And if we return to this picture, again, I really like it because, in this sense, it's really kind of symbolic of this mixed kind of identity they had and kind of the many duties that Buddhist chaplains had while they were there. So Kwon, second from the right, he's wearing his military uniform, combat boots as well, but he's sort of put over this Buddhist monastic's robe to kind of show his identity as a Buddhist clergy. And it's different from the Vietnamese monk who he's standing next to, who he said he became quite close friends with, who's wearing more of a traditional monastic's robe, but they're both kind of flanked by military officers, I think very much representing his kind of indebtedness to the military mission, even as he's becoming closer to Vietnamese monks and Buddhists on the ground. The chaplains are always kind of having to listen to, Buddhist command and try to military command and serve the military's mission. Right? And in their mission there, what became extremely important was so-called civilian outreach activities, or Taemin Hwartong in Korean. These activities were tasks for all in the military, in the South Korean military, including Christian chaplains who were also there with them. But Buddhist identity specifically, the Buddhist chaplains themselves were especially, kind of given this task because of their Buddhist identity. Because the military felt as though the vast majority of Vietnamese were Buddhists. These Korean Buddhist chaplains kind of understood Buddhism and the local community the best, so they would lead these kind of civilian activities. So this, took up, most of, a lot, or if not most of their time and work there. One example of what they did was joint Korean-Vietnamese Dharma services, which Kwon Ki-jong led many of in Saigon, or Ho Chi Minh City, during his work there. These joint Dharma services were done monthly at various locations around Vietnam, and were really there to kind of show off the growing solidarity between the two nations' Buddhists. They kind of brought together, some shared, tradition or services, doing chanting to Shakyamuni, doing seated meditation. They were often attended by, locals, soldiers from either military, by monastics, visiting monastics from Korea as well as politicians at times. Other chaplains who were on the front lines, like Kwon Oh-hyun and others, became deeply involved in kind of social service activities. They worked in schools, hospitals, orphanages, and senior centers. You see Quan here at his time as the principal of a Vietnamese school, which I didn't quite get the full story of how that happened. It's quite unique, but it was just maybe for like a few weeks or a month or so that he took on that job for whatever reason at that school. What was unique for these experiences and what the chaplains really reflected on was that many of these organizations, the schools, hospitals, and so forth, were run by Vietnamese Buddhist organizations. And they really admired these kind of, the strength that they had that kind of was built up over decades to provide these services to the local communities. When they looked back at Korea, they felt that there was nothing like this at home. Korean Buddhist leadership could barely run a few schools, and there was nothing like these hospitals or large kind of senior centers or anything of the case. So they began to kind of wonder why this is the case and how better Korean Buddhism can carry out these activities. Another major activity they carried out there was building Korean-style Buddhist temples in Vietnam. There were 3 of them built over the war years. You see one of them here, Peng Masa, under construction in 1969. These were kind of headquarters for the chaplains' work. They brought specifically materials over from Korea to give them like a special Korean Buddhist feel. But while kind of they served soldiers in the Korean military and the chaplains, they also became shelters for Vietnamese monks and civilians who had lost their homes or temples in bombings. You also see after the temple is finished there, some services for Korean soldiers and an American soldier as well, which kind of Kwan Oyan always liked to point out as these experiences he had kind of with American soldiers who were interested in Buddhism coming to the Korean chaplains' services there. The Buddha statue there as well, pointer. The Buddha statue there as well was specifically donated and funded by the Buddhist community members in Korea. And this really, combined with the entire infrastructure building, was imagined to be kind of spatial markers in Korean Buddhism's, for Korean Buddhism's investment into this conflict and kind of their modernizing strategy, trying to help Vietnamese Buddhists and Korean soldiers there. But these temples were fairly temporary, and they put so much investment into it at the time, only to leave the war a few years later. And and ironically, kind of back home in South Korea, there was nothing of the sort like this for military chaplains to work in. Early chaplains back home in Korea were working in churches at off hours and disused military buildings. The chaplains in Vietnam were like, this is great and all, but why can't we do such similar things back in Korea? Kind of where's the funding and support for these kind of projects in helping along our social engagement? Another interesting example of their work there was when they were the Korean Buddhist representatives to the World Buddhist Sangha Council conference in 1969. The World Buddhist Sangha Council was created in Sri Lanka in the early 60s as kind of part of the growing Buddhist internationalist movement. Korean Buddhist monks were supposed to be the representatives of Korean Buddhism, but they couldn't make it for whatever reason. So the chaplains went in their stead. And the chaplains, I failed to mention this earlier too, is that they were not fully ordained monastics. They were kind of young students of Buddhism who were given a lot of these roles for a typical clergy or monastic, but technically were not fully ordained in that capacity. But in any case, in this situation, they kind of played that role. You see Kwan there wearing the robes of a fully ordained monastic in the Korean Buddhist tradition, as did the other chaplains that were there with him. So they're at this conference with about 300 other monks and Buddhist leaders from around the world. And one chaplain recalled that this was really his most shocking experience in Vietnam, that seeing all of these world Buddhists coming together over common goals was truly significant to kind of his outlook of the war. This conference was specifically addressing the effect of the Vietnam War on Buddhists around the world. And in talking about kind of Buddhism and the war, Korean chaplains noticed that aside from them and maybe Thai Buddhists, they were some of the only ones whose community was pro-war. Right? Most Buddhist communities in attendance were vehemently anti-war. And the chaplains were kind of met with seeing these sort of contradictions and these differences that sort of their community had from other Buddhists. And they again sort of began to reflect on what really the currents were in modern Buddhism, modern Buddhist internationalism, and where their community stood out in some of these major issues, possibly, not in the most positive of ways. So back home in South Korea, while this is going on, media, Buddhist media, is really romanticizing the chaplains' work in Vietnam. They're showing many of the pictures that I showed and, talking about the activities that the chaplains are doing and really holding them up as these exemplars of kind of a modern, youthful, new face of Korean Buddhism. But, despite that rhetoric, the chaplains' experiences were quite different. I mean, they began to see how much of this kind of modernization talk in Korea was empty rhetoric compared to that of Vietnamese Buddhists who were actually meeting the needs of everyday people. They started to develop their own ideas of the best way to carry out their service, and inspired by a lot of what they were seeing. They kind of developed sort of a mistrust of both Buddhist leadership and the military leadership, who had kind of misrepresented what their service there would be. Despite this kind of role that they were given as saviors to Vietnamese, they were subjected to the horrors of the war. Right? Quan saw his division commander dismembered and killed by a friendly grenade in the early days of his service. Other chaplains were very disheartened at constantly seeing soldiers' ashes delivered to the Buddhist temples there, where chaplains were tasked with enshrining them. They also realized that many Vietnamese Buddhists didn't want them there, as their country had made it seem. Many Vietnamese Buddhists were vehemently anti-war, which a stance the Korean Buddhist community was unwilling to take. But like many of the other Korean soldiers who volunteered to serve in Vietnam, and Kwan Oh-yeon was only 24 when he originally went there, these soldiers and chaplains were often kind of at the mercy of the institutions that had power over them. But at the same time, they tried to express their own agency in shaping their work there in Vietnam, often, defying and criticizing some of the Korean Buddhist leadership. They tried to kind of carry out what motivated them to become chaplains, which was, very much this idea of making Korean Buddhism more socially active, more engaged, or kind of popular or youthful as they talked about. And I think we see this in some of the time after the chaplain service. Kwan Oh-yeon, for example, became the first head of the Buddhist chaplaincy organization, advocating for more autonomy from Korean Buddhist leadership and more resources and funding. He also went on to help found a Buddhist university, a Buddhist broadcasting company, and became a large voice in the so-called popularization of Buddhism movement in Korea in the 1980s, which had a large impact on the trajectory of Korean Buddhism going forward. Another chaplain who worked there, Kim Dok-soo, served in Vietnam for about 2 years before going on to serve another 20 in his capacity as a military chaplain. He often defied Buddhist leadership by working across denominational lines, across borders, across religious lines in his Buddhism for Daily Life Association, as he called it, where he provided social services, educated young monks and young students in communities around Korea. He was also the Korean Buddhist representative to the World Fellowship of Buddhist Conferences throughout the 80s, where he traveled to Sri Lanka, the United States, and Japan. He went on a variety of other kind of self-funded, often international outreach trips, like this one in Myanmar, where he really believed in kind of connecting Korean Buddhism to the wider global Buddhist community. Another chaplain, Venerable Chagwang, who was kind of actually uniquely a fully ordained monastic throughout his entire service beginning in 1970. He served in Vietnam for about a year, and then also uniquely returned back to Vietnam after the war to kind of work more with monks on the ground, learn more about social organizations there. He's actually someone I'm trying to kind of work more with and kind of get to know his story more, as it's quite interesting. He was in the chaplaincy for another 20 years, becoming the head chaplain as well. After his retirement, he was frequently seen in Buddhist media. He gave talks at prisons and hospitals, at city halls. He became the chairman of Dongguk University, the main Buddhist university in Korea, in 2016. And he especially, really, as all the other chaplains did, kind of identified that experience in Vietnam as formative to how he saw his work going forward. And I think that this is really kind of represented what's represented in the lives of these chaplains is kind of the lasting impact very much of the Vietnam War and how important kind of the chaplaincy was in developing some of these modernization ideas in Korean Buddhism. So getting to kind of a loose conclusion here, kind of working with some of these lasting impacts on Vietnam. Besides, say, some of these stories, we see that there is now a very self-identified, engaged Buddhist movement in Korea, kind of attached to the movement that started in Vietnam, really began in Korea through the 1980s and forward. We also see how many actual soldiers who served in Vietnam became Buddhist monks or devout Buddhists to deal with the trauma of the war as well. I've kind of heard some stories about that. But really, to me, I think the most kind of remarkable impact of the Vietnam War was creating the chaplaincy. Though it began very humbly with 5 men, it's now grown into a large institution. Hundreds, if not close to 1,000 chaplains have served up to this point. And it really stands at the forefront of innovation for Korean Buddhism and inspires a lot of monastics to continue doing this social work. And in certain ways, there's kind of a gender dimension to this as well, that a lot of these conclusions are quite true for male monks specifically in Korea, who have been slower than their female counterparts to do this social engagement and kind of be more active in international Buddhist organizations. It's often through the chaplaincy that they first take on more of these public-facing work and go on to live lives defined by more of those social activities and international outreach. In Korean female monastics have been much more active in international Buddhist organizations over the last few decades, as well as kind of social service organizations in Korea, but and as well as some female monastics serving as chaplains as well in the last 10 years or so. So I think all of this kind of really points out to the importance of seeing the Vietnam War and even other wars from the perspective of religious communities. We can't simply understand kind of the Korean Buddhist perspective of this war simply through politics or through abstract ethical debates, right? The lived experiences of chaplains, prove to be very formative in shaping their ideas about what Korean Buddhism could be going forward and help to sort of redefine ideas of modernizing Korean Buddhism that were really in their infancy in the mid-20th century. So I think as I kind of continue researching this topic, I kind of continue to emphasize seeing the Vietnam War as kind of Buddhist war with all the Buddhists that were involved in it from a variety of countries. So yeah, that's about all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for the fascinating talk. So now the floor is open for questions. I think we only have one microphone. I will pass it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, for the wonderful talk and to hear you unfold more of your research. Very, very interesting. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the kind of the origins of the chaplain role as the Koreans encountered it, because you sort of said that they had been inspired into that to forming the chaplaincy through their interactions with the Vietnamese. Did the Vietnamese have chaplains, or was it just their overall engaged state that and then what were they drawing on in what was informing their understanding of what a chaplain is and who should do it, and maybe also some comments on the English word chaplain and then the two Korean words that you held up, and maybe some different assumptions that go with each of those and how they've been used at different points in time by the Koreans themselves.
Okay. Yeah, so South Vietnam during the war had a Buddhist military chaplaincy also. So they did, I guess I forgot to mention that as well, that they did have a chaplaincy. Vietnam doesn't anymore, but at the time, monks were working in the military. There was a difference between how they and the Korean chaplains did. Many of them were simply like monks who came from a temple and were in the military for like a little while and then went back to their temple. Whereas like Korean chaplains were this fully like professionalized, permanent clergy in the military. And I think the most direct inspiration at the time was the Christian chaplaincy in Korea. Like, it began during the Korean War, like Korean War started in 1950, and I think the first Christian chaplains were in 1951, and really inspired by U.S. Christian chaplains. They kind of, during the Korean War, worked together with each other to kind of train what the chaplaincy would be in the Korean military. So I think in many ways they were inspired to kind of compete with Christians in the military and at least take on this role because they felt there were so many Buddhists in the military that were converting to Christianity because that was the only religion that was represented in there for almost 20 years before the Buddhist chaplaincy was created. So yeah, I think in like a lot of their early work, they tried to kind of mimic what Christian chaplains were doing, have like Sunday services. They were even working in like churches, as I said. So that was kind of that only immediate reference that they had. They also had the Japanese colonial period from before, where Japanese Buddhists really supported the Japanese Empire. Korean Buddhists who were colonized by Japan very much engaged in the same kind of propaganda, encouraging young men to join the Japanese military, especially in the 1930s and 1940s. So there's sort of always that looming in the background as well. I think no one would ever say, none of the kind of archival stuff, or no one I've ever talked to has directly said, that's kind of an influence, but it's always kind of looming there as like sort of violent Buddhism got in the Japanese Empire. And yeah, I mean, on the naming, I think chaplain is really based in like a Christian term for the military. I don't know like the exact kind of origins of the word, but it was kind of always termed this way in English, as Christians were the first one to be chaplains in, say, European countries or the United States, and then other religions kind of just took on that name. But then it's also kind of the same word for, say, like hospital chaplains or prison chaplains. I think then when we look at the name in Korean, you have that same kind of like compound word, I guess you could call it, for all the chaplains. It's sort of like military pastor, military father, military monk. is like how all the names for chaplains in the Korean military are kind of made. So yeah, I think just for all of them, it's very much this kind of like, let's bring sort of the military and the religion together. And they really, I think it's like interestingly acts as kind of this medium between these two institutions that they find themselves.
Except in the Korean, you would have the, for example, you wouldn't have, you wouldn't have the, I mean, the characters in Korean are for like military monk, right? And you wouldn't have that in the Christian context.
Right,
so even though you've got like a unifying idea, actually the names are specific to the religious traditions, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what word do they use today?
For
that
Buddhist chaplain.
For the chaplain.
Same thing. The kunsum.
Okay.
Yeah, usually. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's like it's slightly. I mean, because they're all now fully ordained monastics, so they're usually just kind of called like venerable or something as well. But kind of in the third person, they're called like kunsum in the military. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing your research. If I can just follow up. I don't know if I understood correctly, but you said that the Korean chaplains were pro-war, and that kind of differentiated them from the Vietnamese, right? That I find this very intriguing as a statement. Is it that they were pro-war, or was it that they were pragmatic, that war is happening, so Buddhism should be there to offer spiritual service or advice to people or some sort of, or were they actually for war? Because I think that would, of course, contradict very much the very spirit of Buddhism, right? Which is very much based on nonviolence and ahimsa. So I find very intriguing that statement that you say they were pro-war. Can you like unpack this for us a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's fairly true in most ways of saying it, in that I think they, at least from kind of institutional outlets, Korean Buddhist leadership certainly was saying communism is a direct threat to the survival of Buddhism. If we don't fight, there will be no Buddhism in Vietnam, and Korea will fall next. But they were fighting with North Korea. They had seen the atrocities of the Korean War, how much damage, communist troops did, as well as like U.S. military, to Buddhist temples. I mean, you go to Korea, it's like every Buddhist temple has the story of like being destroyed during the Korean War. And even the politics at the time were really reinforcing that idea that like this was worth fighting. That like, yeah, it's all nice to stand for peace, but we can't just sit on the side as like Buddhism gets destroyed. So, I wouldn't say then that the chaplains, in their work were like, fight. They, like, that's the differentiation there. Like they were kind of working with that in their ear, but a lot of their activities were then pragmatic, just trying to make the best of the situation. They believed that the military being there probably was a good idea, that the war was kind of worth fighting, but it wasn't as if they were preaching all of this, very pro-war like rhetoric to the soldiers at all time. But I think that's what motivated it, yeah.
And, did they receive military training, or were they? They did.
Yeah.
So because you saw some for the photos you saw, they were dressed up like with military uniforms. So they were both soldiers, but they wouldn't like be fighting or shooting, right? They would be in the background, or what is exactly their position in the military?
Yeah, so they were officers. So yeah, not I guess combat soldiers specifically, but they carried guns and used them defensively. They weren't at the front of a push, but there were instances where they needed to use them in a battle, like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So they were fully trained like that, and like that kind of anecdote is like Kwan was. It was like straight away like ambush training. It's like you got to be there with us when we kind of storm a village or we get attacked by some, North Vietnamese troops, and you need to know what to do, right? And that. So, yeah, I think it's a unique case. Like in the history of the Buddhist chaplaincy, this was really the only hot war, right? The chaplaincy has become quite different, I guess, now because it hasn't fought such a direct war since then. It was technically war with North Korea, but there hasn't quite been this instance. So that part, was much more emphasized at the time than, say, it is now. But yeah, it was definitely there.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. I see there was a monk who burned himself, and I know Thich Nhat Hanh was so famous in Vietnam. He is a monk and has written so many famous books. I just realized, is it because of suffering from war so that make Vietnamese believe in Buddhism?
I mean, at least kind of Thich Nhat Hanh's specific brand of like engaged Buddhism, I think really took hold, in part, because of this war. That movement, kind of engaged Buddhism or this more socially active Buddhism, has roots in Vietnam earlier than this, in the early 20th century, under French colonialism, where they felt that kind of Buddhist institutions, kind of social welfare, social activism could be part of sort of more independent, fighting for Vietnamese independence and so forth, helping communities in poverty. But yeah, I mean, I think those events, like in 1963, then gave those kind of socially engaged movements a much more global audience too. That kind of helped it along as well. And Thich Nhat Hanh and others became very kind of well versed in understanding like global politics and things that then really made them more kind of effective to bringing in Vietnamese people kind of into Buddhism and supporting it. Yeah, sure.
Okay, any other questions?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation again. Actually, it's sort of second time when I'm listening part of it. My question is regarding chaplaincy. Is it one of the main roles to actually tend to people who are dying, or offering these spiritual services, or like people before dying, for those like with heavy injuries? At least in hospitals or in Christianism, this is one of the roles. So that's why they were sent to war. I understand, they are officers, they were part of the military, it's a little bit different, but I think one of the pragmatic and important role was actually, especially, right, when we're talking about these wars.
Yeah. I think absolutely, during the time of the war, that was a huge role. But I feel like I was saying, I mean, today where there isn't really hot wars going on with the Korean military, it's not as big a part of their service, maybe in comparison to, say, hospital chaplains or prison chaplains. But yeah, I mean, there was, a kind of the list of sort of ceremonies and rituals that the chaplains were trained to do in those early days has, a lot to do with death, that kind of the initial funeral service, and then one a few months, and then, kind of following the various, the Buddhist traditions and doing that. So, but I think it's, the rituals and things in that sense, like they play sort of just one part of many, especially in comparison to chaplains working elsewhere. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions?
Thank you. In terms of understanding Buddhism and promoting Buddhism, do you see any difference between those Buddhist chaplains, especially those returned from the Vietnam War, and the local Buddhist monastic members who have never been or engaged in the ministry?
Like that. You mean kind of afterwards in that? Yeah, I mean, I think I see a lot more kind of propensity to doing some of these socially active kind of services, like I said, kind of working in like media, broadcasting companies, working in schools, and things like that back home in Korea. But I think that's actually a kind of a good point to make, or somewhere to kind of go further, because I think I'm still like trying to figure, how best to sort of represent like what is this kind of impact of what they're doing. And I think you definitely see a lot of similar activities from, say, monks that didn't serve in the war, the chaplaincy as well. but it was, I think, a little more unique in the early days. Like from the 1980s and 1990s, I think a lot of this became a bit more common in Korean Buddhism, but in, say, the 60s, it was a lot more sort of fraught about what exactly the kind of social engagement would be among kind of Buddhist clergy. So it stands out a little more there, but I think that's kind of a good comparative way to look at it.
Yes.
So you've been using the term socially engaged to describe what's going on, and is that the exact terminology that was used? And more broadly, do you feel that there is enough attention to socially engaged being understood in this historical period as potentially being engaged in war and violence in the general, well, understandings among Buddhists of what engaged Buddhism or its various varieties are, and among the scholarship as well?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I guess using it, I use it with like a lowercase socially engaged, not like Thich Nhat Hanh's like engaged Buddhism kind of thing, but these were all terms that they were using. I think anything that I said was like modernization, social engagement, like youthicizing, like making more youthful or something, like popularization. All of those kind of terms were kind of all floating around of this and all kind of using that to sort of frame what they were doing there. And yeah, I think looking at kind of engaged Buddhism more broadly, I've heard some kind of really interesting opinions in scholarship now about it's like Buddhists fighting in war engaged Buddhists, right? And I think there's always going to be, you know, if I ever sort of read, say, Thich Nhat Hanh's work or others, there seems to always kind of be like a breaking point where it's like, you know, where we kind of act as Buddhists in these mindful ways, in these compassionate ways, yet we never look away, like in the face of social injustice against, you know, people around the world facing these problems. So I think some, you know, may take that as kind of like, say, in this situation where fighting this war was kind of the right thing to do, to fight sort of social injustice or the survival of the religion.
Okay. Any other questions? I think I will take the privilege as the chair and to ask some questions. Fascinating talk. I have several questions. And I guess I will just carry on the conversation that we had over the dinner, and which is about the idea of more, because the Korean chaplaincy, they also center around the idea of modern and also socially engaged, which actually remind me of D.T. Suzuki, who was such a prominent figure in the Japanese Buddhism at that period of time, who sort of also endorsed the use of, let's say, military means to promote Buddhism, to promote the right Buddhism. So I wonder, can you highlight a bit more on the relationship between, let's say, Japanese Buddhism or Korean Buddhism, or whether this Korean chaplaincy that you mentioned today in your talk, did they got inspiration actually from D.T. Suzuki or from other sources?
I can't say yet D.T. Suzuki specifically, I guess, you know, maybe in the broader umbrella of like modernizing Buddhism. I think looking at D.T. Suzuki's, say, writings in like during Japanese Empire and that, what directly relates to kind of what Korean Buddhists are then thinking in early South Korea after the Japanese colonial period is how the Buddhist state relationship should be. There was never really a point up until, say, the 1950s that Korean Buddhism institutionally saw itself as separate from, say, the state or something, right, from government. There was always a relationship there, historically, and during the colonial period when the Japanese Empire took that role and feeling it was kind of their need to, yeah, sure, their need to kind of support the state that was kind of supporting them, that was creating kind of a home for Buddhists, right? So when we get to the kind of the post-colonial period, I think a lot of those assumptions are still there, that even though kind of when you think about like modern Buddhism is often kind of a deinstitutionalized, like kind of separate from politics or the state. In their telling, it was very much a kind of statist project and a very highly institutionalized project that was also modern, that it just needed to fit more of these kind of modern ideas facing them, like say democracy or fighting against communism, and that's where they could kind of come together. So yeah, I mean, I think there's some similarities there, and then trying to kind of point out these other strong voices in modernizing Buddhism besides T.T. Suzuki, like some from Vietnamese Buddhism that kind of people haven't understood quite yet in the terms of Korean Buddhism, like how they influenced. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Maybe I'll just add a quick one,
Sure.
quick questions as well. It's the second largest Buddhist chaplaincy now. So is the Vietnam War period currently viewed as a celebration of an origin story of this chaplaincy in Korea, or is it also critically actually viewed as something like a moral compromise in that period of time? I mean, nowadays. And another thing is about the sources that you use, because I myself I work on material culture. So apart to the first-hand material that you work on, are they mainly archive documents, diaries, or is there something like a monument established or erected in the monasteries or something like that that actually celebrate like the origin story of the chaplaincy itself?
Yeah, I mean, on that last one, I wouldn't say that I've seen anything like that, but certainly that the official histories of the chaplaincy talk very much about the Vietnam War and how important it was, and not necessarily qualifying what went on at times, just maybe downplaying it or so. And maybe that's why it's hard to get information, more of, say, not objective, but just a variety of opinions, and the importance of talking to some of those early chaplains, that their sort of visions differentiated from these institutional perspectives. Yeah, and in terms of, the research, it's some of that. It's looking at some of these kind of official representations of the chaplaincy, some government archives, how kind of the government saw Buddhism as a tool, in a sense, in the conflict. A lot of media. I mean, the kind of that was a big thing of looking at various journals, magazines, newspapers from the time that told many stories about the chaplaincy's development, brought in some different opinions as well, but also kind of having the shadow of institutional Buddhism and some of the opinions inherent to that as well. And then, just kind of collecting sort of the oral histories on the ground. Some chaplains have wrote kind of autobiographies, memoirs, but then also just talking to them, collecting some of their own personal materials. I mean, a lot of the photos here were kind of given to me personally also, and some other things that kind of only chaplains had, some of the materials they used during the war. So it was kind of piecing together a lot of these things, right?
Fascinating. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, if not, please join me thanking Jonathan again for his fascinating talk. And then we can end the section a bit earlier. So it's heavy rain outside as well. So people can get safer and earlier. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.